Welcome, everyone. My name is Roberta Raffaetà. I'm NICHE Deputy Director, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Stefan Helmreich. Stefan is Professor of Anthropology at MIT. He studies how scientists in oceanography, biology, acoustics, and computer science define and theorize their objects of study, particularly as these objects, such as waves, light, sound, and code, reach their conceptual limits. Today he will introduce his latest book, A Book of Waves, but he has a long track record of articles and books. His previous ethnography, entitled Alien Ocean, Anthropological Voyages in Microbial Seas, edited by University of California Press in 2009, is a study of marine biologists working in realms usually out of sight and reach: the microscopic world, the deep sea, and oceans outside national sovereignty. Winner of the 2017 Staley Prize from the School of Advanced Research, the 2012 Rachel Carson Book Prize from the Society for Social Studies of Science, the 2010 Senior Book Prize from the American Ethnological Society, and finally, the 2010 Gregory Bateson Book Prize from the Society for Cultural Anthropology. This book charts how marine microbes are entangled with debates about the origin of life, climate change, property in the ocean commons, and the possibility of life on other worlds. An even earlier book entitled Silicon Second Nature, Culturing Artificial Life in a Digital World, University of California Press, 1998, is an ethnography of computer modeling in the life sciences. It won the 2000 Diane Forsyth Book Prize from the American Anthropological Association. And finally, the book Sounding the Limits of Life, Essays in the Anthropology of Biology and Beyond, Princeton University Press, 2016, is a collection of essays that asks after changing definition of life, water, and sound, and even features a soundtrack. Again, it won the 2016 Michelle Kendrick Book Prize from the Society for Literature, Science, and Arts. And finally, the book What is Life has been co-edited with Natasha Meyers, Sophia Rusts, and Michael Rossi. This book is an art and science book that reproduces pages from key texts in the history of biology, interleaving these with essays that ask what the category of life has meant to biologists. So please welcome with me Stefan. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Roberta, for that extremely kind introduction, and thank you to NICHE for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I'll just dive right in. So I want to speak to you today from material from my recent book, A Book of Waves, which is an anthropological examination of how oceanographers and coastal engineers, mostly in the US and the Netherlands, though also in Australia, Japan, and Bangladesh, study waves. I'm interested in how these scientists represent waves as avatars of an oceanic nature at once periodic and irreversible, wild and pacific, ephemeral and eternal, and I discuss how they do so in the field, the lab, and the computer. And I argue that wave science, so bound up with prediction, is about time, about orientations toward the future, coastal, environmental, national, political, and planetary. And my talk today zeroes in on one particular chapter from the book, on fieldwork that I conducted at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Rising into view from the motorboat that I have hired from Marina del Rey, California on this October 2017 day is the Floating Instrument Platform, or FLIP, a seagoing research vessel operated by the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. FLIP is moored some 35 miles off Malibu, positioned in 600-meter deep water, floating at coordinates I was emailed by the platform's chief scientist. It is a singular vessel, offering an off-kilter vantage point on the sea. In its horizontal orientation, FLIP can be towed out to sea like an ordinary craft, but by flipping 90 degrees into vertical once it reaches its at-sea destination, it becomes an enormous spar buoy, more or less stationary in the wave field, looking like nothing so much as a maritime metal treehouse. With 7/8 of the platform's 108-meter length below the surface, and all the instrumentation inside its top 1/8 swiveled on gimbals by 90 degrees, scientists can study ocean dynamics from a platform with only a slow bob. I've secured a berth on FLIP to do anthropological fieldwork on oceanographic fieldwork, to join scientists examining the zone where air meets water, where ocean waves broker the exchange of heat, gas, and momentum between sea and sky, shaping weather and climate. I want to know how these researchers do their science at sea, as opposed to on paper, in computer simulations, or in laboratory wave tanks. My first observation is that oceanographers study waves in the field by seeking to hold their scaffolds of apprehension still. That operation has them flipping frames of reference, moving from being wave-tossed and seasick to being aloof, pivoting from grid-like mathematical accountings to considerations of their work as a source of wonder, a fund for ecological attunement, and a process rotating in and out of alignment with the pure and the applied. FLIP is a legend in oceanography. Built in the 1960s, its earliest use was for Cold War research into submarine acoustics, as well as Pacific storm tracks, key knowledge for mid-20th century US expansion across that ocean. FLIP has been central to making sea space legible to oceanographers, but also to the US military. The vessel, though operated by Scripps, is owned by the Navy. The platform, not technically a ship since it has no propulsion power of its own, puts me in mind of the lithographs of M.C. Escher, full of sideways doors, swiveling sinks, tables in dual orientations. Having toured FLIP in port on its side in San Diego, I compare my photos of what rooms look like this way rather than that. When I spend my first night on FLIP, I realize that my top bunk faces a ceiling that is on sideways days a door. I recall Wittgenstein's storied cartoon duck that becomes a rabbit when one flips one's perception of it, seeing what was, in one frame of reference, a duck's bill becoming rabbit ears in another. FLIP came into service a couple of decades after Scripps' research on wave prediction for World War II, which unfolded at or near beaches, aimed at forecasting waves for Allied amphibious landings on Nazi-held shores like Normandy, an effort led by European immigrant and expatriate oceanographers Walter Munk and Harold Sverdrup, pictured in the lower left. During the Cold War, Scripps scientists turned their attention to the open sea. FLIP was built just after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which motivated US technoscience to undertake spectacular, often futuristic constructions. In its final decades, FLIP was retired as a platform in 2020. It became a site for studying how waves break in the open sea, relevant for knowledge about shifting distributions of carbon dioxide, climate change. So in what follows, I chronicle my stay on FLIP, providing a glimpse of seagoing wave science, gesturing along the way toward the history of such science. Contexts of wave research, discovery, motivation, and justification have shifted from older military to newer ecological concerns. Waves have become readable to scientists through a series of conceptual schemes made available by media technologies, including time-stepped aerial photography, visualizations of wavelengths in electronic communications, for example, graphs of the radio spectrum, infrared readings of turbulence, and laboratory simulation. Scientists apprehend waves through mediations, viewing waves to adapt terms from media theory as forces of transmission, as patterns that materialize at interfaces of air and water, of buoys and computer screens, and as mechanisms of inscription, producing traces that can be read, for instance, for evidence of distant storms. Technologically, and media forms imprint on how ocean waves manifest as objects of knowledge. Nietzsche once observed that our writing instruments are also working on our thoughts, flipping the script on the usual assumed directionality between thinking and inscription. Wave science, to draw on Roland Barthes, is a practice of interpretation in which, quote, the reader is no longer a consumer, but a producer of text, unquote. So I'm thinking of the very literal way in which scientists read waves and the practice of understanding waves as a practice of reading and a practice of media, a kind of media literacy. So back to flip. My first fieldwork frame of reference flips when I leap from my boat onto the neck of flip. I clamber up the craft's ladder and meet the 9 researchers and 5 crew with whom I will spend the next 3 days. They've been here a few weeks. I ask an engineer assistant to the chief scientist to draw me a diagram of the instruments arrayed on the frame of flip, keyed to their scientist operators. I come across Dave, fresh from his PhD from the University of Miami. He stands on a graded metal walkway, studying the waves. I ask him what he sees. He says, quote, young waves developing, westerlies turning on. It's the afternoon sea breeze. It seems like the swell has died a little bit, but you can see a longer oscillation coming in from the Pacific Ocean. And the short waves we see here are going to come and mess things up for everyone trying to surf. You're seeing whitecapping a bit. 10 knots is about the cutoff, unquote. Dave is in charge of a surface-following meteorological mast that he calls FLOP, for Flip's lowest observation point. They love naming things. Tethered to one of the booms, FLOP consists of a pole that has mounted onto it temperature, humidity, and pressure sensors, as well as a motion pack, which Dave tells me, quote, measures linear acceleration and rotation, from which we can extract wave information. Back inside Flip, he shows me a computer screen translating that data into a scrolling visualization that shows the spectrum of wave energy over the course of the day in the patch of sea in which we're situated. Is that patch representative of wave fields in the sea at similar latitudes elsewhere? That's a question that this data might address through the comparison of ecologies. To flip the order of words in anthropologist Tim Choi's important ecologies of comparison. As we watch wave frequencies scroll, I recall the history of how waves came to be understood as spectral media in the first place. This is a diagram of the spectrum of wave energies, which was first gathered into representation in the 1960s. Wave observations before World War II were not yet animated by a sense that waves might be sorted by frequency into a wave spectrum, analogous to spectra of light, sound, or radio waves. Before such a framework became available, waves were understood largely through gathering data from wave stations, from which observers would report incoming wave heights and periods. Sometimes scientists got in the water to measure waves themselves. Here's Willard Bascom in the 1940s, his stance fusing a dedication to disinterested accounting with an in-the-thick-of-it can-doism, one that historian Naomi Oreskes has argued crafted mid-century oceanographic objectivity as a mix of masculine detachment and outdoorsy passion. Less in the thick of it, time and motion studies at piers and beaches generated side views of waves like this. This is a once confidential document of wave profiles from the Scripps Oceanographic Pier. And at mid-century, something new to wave science came into use. Aerial photography, a representation of the sea flipped from looking across the horizon, the seascape, to looking down on the sea as a kind of map of itself. Wave scientists had long known that waves were generated by ocean storms, which imparted energy to water and created swells that moved across the sea with definite wavelengths. Rachel Carson, in The Sea Around Us, summarized dominant scientific wisdom around mid-century. Quote, as the waves roll in toward Land's End at the westernmost tip of England, they bring the feel of distant places of the Atlantic. As they approach the rocky tip of Land's End, they pass over a strange instrument lying on the sea bottom. By the fluctuating pressure of their rise and fall, they tell this instrument many things of the distant Atlantic water from which they have come, and their messages are translated by its mechanisms into symbols understandable to the human mind. If you visited this place and talked to the meteorologist in charge, he could tell you the life histories of the waves that are rolling in. He would tell you where the waves were created by the action of wind on water, the strength of winds that produce them, how fast the storm is moving. Most of the waves, he would tell you, are born in the stormy North Atlantic, unquote. Such waves, it came to be surmised in the 1940s, might be sorted out by their frequency, the inverse of their periods, into a spectrum. The intuition came from communications media. British wave scientists during World War II lit upon the idea that it might be possible to measure the variation of frequency of time with wave records from an observing station and infer the geographical origins of waves with varied frequencies. 20-minute records of wave pressure taken by undersea gauges would be relayed to a rotating drum. But where a usual record might be rendered by a pen zigzagging lines on a rolling cylinder, here researchers turned to a method that was inspired by sound-tracked film. The director of the Wave Group in England, oceanographer George Deacon, recalled that his colleague, Jack Derbyshire, quote, had a friend in the film industry, and we learned that the Walt Disney film Fantasia, which was then a recent success, had the sound part of the film as black and white wavy silhouettes along the sides of the picture frames. It therefore occurred to us that we could do the same thing. We could use photographic paper, and instead of printing lines, we would have a big block of light which would move about, generating a silhouette of the waves. We could then put this on a wheel, and as the wheel spun around, the variations in black and white could be detected by a photocell, unquote. Movies with sound were not the only media to inspire the spectral model. Oceanographer Willard Pearson adapted the spectrum model to wave records from the work of statistician John Tukey, who used it to examine the statistical properties of noise in electronic circuits. Tukey rendered waves as populations, not individuals, similarly to how sociology at the time was coming to study people. No coincidence, then, that Tukey later co-authored a review of the statistical underpinnings of the Kinsey Report on Sexual Behavior. In these borrowings, scientists turned to emergent media to understand the medium of the ocean. If water waves had been the model for sound and electromagnetic waves, here researchers generated analogies back the other direction, flipping the script, which is a phrase, by the way, from a 1991 hip-hop song by Peter Rock and C.L. Smooth. That's where that comes from. So, the formalism of the wave spectrum makes ocean waves in the medium of seawater thinkable as media in a communicative sense. As Don Durham Peters writes, quote, the old idea that media are environments can be flipped. Environments are also media, unquote. Melody Jew argues in Wild Blue Media that oceanic phenomena knowable through media, cameras, sonar, scuba, satellites, can themselves be theorized as media. Wave spectra came into focus in an ocean-spanning project during the summer of 1963, when Scripps oceanographer Walter Munk led Waves Across the Pacific, a project that tracked trains of waves from their origins in Antarctic storms across 10,000 miles of Pacific Ocean toward their arrival on the shores of Alaska. Munk, with 8 other oceanographers, arrayed wave sensors at 6 sites across the Pacific, including one on Flip. A 1967 documentary about the project offers in its publicity text a list of locations. Camp Palliser Light in New Zealand, a rugged, and pay attention to the rhetoric of island isolation that is present in these descriptions. Cape Palliser Light in New Zealand, a rugged, storm-battered point where the arrival of the great waves from an Antarctic storm could be expected. To Twila, one of the volcanic islands of Samoa, 2,100 miles to the northeast. The uninhabited equatorial atoll of Palmyra, 1,600 miles beyond Samoa, only 2 miles wide with no point of land more than 6 feet above sea level. The easily accessible Koala Basin in downtown Honolulu, selected for the Central Wave Station and expedition headquarters. The islandless North Pacific, where the U.S. Navy's Mobile Island Flip floating instrument platform was stationed at 45 degrees north and 150 degrees west. And the final recording site in Alaskan Beach, the end of the line for the trains of waves, unquote. The task was to follow waves as they arrived over a great arc spanning the southern and northern hemisphere with the hope of using this knowledge to improve wave forecasting. The project required observing stations that could permit scientists to position pressure sensors on a not-too-deep seafloor, or in the case of Flip, on its stem just below the surface. Sensors would need to be sensitive enough to measure waves as extensive as a mile long and as squat as 1/10 of a millimeter high. Sensors translated changing water pressure into electrical signals relayed to spooling computer punch tape. The Waves Across the Pacific film shows scientists unrolling tape records and poking pencils through holes to make dots representing wave heights. Such graphs permitted scientists to map patterns they hypothesized would become readable to stations later in the chain. Translating punch tape into graphs, radioing, phoning, shipping, and more could generate spectra to sort the patterns out. The film shows the deployment of multiple media: tungsten wire, water, magnets, brass cylinders, globes, rulers, typewriters, filing cabinets, paper, pencils, punch tapes, tape computers, telephones, all of which underscore the mediations through which waves come to be known. Note that all of the in-the-field oceanographers are men. Women, mostly secretaries, record keepers, some scientists, are on land, a gendered division of labor shaped by oceanography's use of sex-segregated Navy infrastructure and by dominant U.S. institutionalization of gender roles. Taken as a whole, the Waves Across the Pacific project came to render the Pacific Ocean into a giant transmitter of wave signals. The travel of its swells mimes the relay of information by scientists from one station to another. The ocean becomes akin to a radio, a wavy medium that sends information about storms. In Waves Across the Pacific, the script has Monk remarked for this project that, quote, the sea itself was our laboratory, unquote. This laboratory was available because, with the exception of New Zealand, most points along the Great Circle had come since World War II to be under American rule, either as territories of the United States, Tutuila on American Samoa and Palmyra, or as states, Hawaii and Alaska. As historians of oceanography, Michael Reedy and Helen Roswadowski argue, quote, knowledge of the ocean was and remains inextricably connected to mid-century geopolitics and the growth of modern science. The expansion of empire enabled scientists to study topics that required the accumulation and subsequent reduction, tabulation, and graphing of large amounts of observational data from all over the globe, unquote. The geopolitical context that made Waves Across the Pacific possible is left out of the documentary film that I've been quoting here. The film's narrator paints a picture of the Pacific as a space of nature, with scientists, quote, tracking waves that propagate across the entire Pacific, the largest body of water on our planet, waves that are interrupted only occasionally by the upthrust of a lonely coral atoll, waves that smash endlessly against the rock of high volcanic islands like Samoa, waves which 10 days later die quietly on the beaches of distant coasts, the end of a journey half around the world, unquote. But these waves also move through geopolitical space. The lonely coral atoll of Palmyra was occupied by the U.S. Navy from 1939 to 59, during which time the Navy built a runway and dredged a ship channel, after which the island was used in 1962 as a site from which the Department of Defense observed nuclear tests above nearby Johnson Atoll. The waves that, quote, smash endlessly against a rock of high volcanic islands like Samoa, unquote, meet not just a shore, but also a Marine Corps outpost. And the distant coast of the experiment is in Alaska, which had in 1959 become a U.S. state. When the script has a scientist say about the experiment, quote, we preferred islands we could get to, unquote, it leaves aside the conditioning historical context. This context included military networks at mid-century. Oh, right, this is what I just quoted. At mid-century, entangled with nuclear detonations in the Western Pacific. U.S. weapons testing enrolled Scripps oceanographers led by Roger Revelle, who wrote that the Navy, quote, wanted to learn about the waves that would be produced by the air and underwater explosions and about the dispersion of radioactive materials in the lagoon and ocean waters, unquote, later declaring that, quote, the atomic bomb is a wonderful oceanographic tool, unquote. In 1952, the U.S. dropped a hydrogen bomb on Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Walter Munk and Willard Bascom, whom you've seen photos of before, were tasked with measuring the resulting waves. They were sort of sent out onto these boats to watch the detonation and measure the resulting waves. Bascom, interestingly, had recently been diagnosed with cancer, which made him feel very brave about subjecting himself to further radioactivity. If wave predictions for Normandy during a hot war sought to know a near-future wavescape, so-called tests in the Western Pacific had the military flip the script, figuring shock waves as proxies for not yet arrived waves of war. The time imagined by the Navy was the hypothetical time of nuclear combat. For Marshall Islanders, none of this was hypothetical. Disaster arrived right then, with winds and waters becoming a time bomb, bringing cancer over the next generations. Waves and wave knowledge, in other words, exist in the wake of history. I'm inspired to this phrasing by Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, in which she presses readers to remember the transverse waves of the wake of Atlantic slave ships. For Sharp, following poet Derek Walcott, the sea is history, and waves, particularly ship-made waves, may be its haunting inscriptions. We can say something resonant about waves in the wake of testing in the Pacific. Marshallese poet Kathy Jetniel Kijiner brings the atoll's story into the present, with a vignette of patients at an island hospital inundated by the waves of sea level rise. Quote, a nuclear history threaded into their bloodlines woke to a wild water world, a rushing rapid of salt. Unquote. The ocean is a substance churning together different moments in history with nuclear age-released radioactive isotopes of carbon, cesium, strontium, and plutonium still circulating in today's ocean as just one enduring marker of the Cold War. The Waves Across the Pacific film offers the ocean not as a site of geopolitics or history, but as a site of wild nature, emphasized through images of field-working oceanographers, white men, often in shorts, wearing no shirts, sometimes sporting tropical bead necklaces. The filmmakers drew upon tropes representing Pacific Islanders in Hollywood films as docile natives, giving viewers scientists and waves with lives, but not local or indigenous people. Flip, meanwhile, taking wave measurements at her lonely North Pacific station, was a space of pure technology. Flip becomes what Roswardowski and Van Kuren call a machine in Neptune's garden, drawing here on Leo Marx's analysis in The Machine in the Garden of how American pastoral landscapes have come to unfold and include modern technology. Think of bucolic scenes of trains in the countryside. Flip, as an avatar of science, comes to fit right into this wild ocean space, within and apart from it at the same time, a patch at the elemental interface of air and water. But Flip is a weird machine in the garden. Its serious side is always doubled by the sideways flippiness of the thing. It awakens in scientists a sense of wonder. Some of this derives from the disorienting but intriguing affirmation that the embodied perspective of humans is conventional, that answering questions always requires a frame of reference, and that frame can, under the right circumstances, be shifted. Flip offers an instantiation of a meta-objective viewpoint, one in which the relative coordinates of experience nest within a grid of absolute values in which up and down are orientations, not ontologies. David Valentine, in ethnographic work among space travel enthusiasts, observes that the aspirational space tourists he knows think relativistically about gravity. In zero-G, on other planets, and on hypothetical circular space stations that might produce artificial gravity through centrifugal force. Gravity, suspended and reorganized, puts for them its status as a universal universal, as a ground, into question. On Flip, of course, where gravity never goes away, but just shifts experiential direction, disorientation highlights the limited perceptual tuning of humans, a tuning that can be outsourced to observing instruments that can flip axes without getting confused. Still, the moment of the flip is, for scientists, an interstitial moment of wonder. After a while, some of the science party are feeling sorry for me because I missed the flip. One tells me, quote, we were giggling like kids. The momentum when it righted itself, it's like a mixture of excitement and, oh no, this could be the time that Flip has a catastrophic accident. It became a big metal treehouse like the Lost Boys had in Peter Pan, unquote. In The Cow in the Elevator, her ethnography of wonder, Tulsi Srinivas reminds us that the OED defines wonder as, quote, the emotion excited by the perception of something novel and unexpected, unquote. Indeterminate shifting gravity, observes anthropologist Deborah Battaglia in her reading of Astronaut Diaries, is often experienced as a zone of levity, of joking. As if to confirm that analysis, scientists on Flip receive a certificate of flipping, complete with calligraphy suggesting an antique age of sail, like those tongue-in-cheek documents that sailors get when they cross the equator. If, as I have argued, models of ocean waves bear traces of the media through which they have been measured, imagined, and compared, becoming doubles or afterimages, say, of radio waves, it is when waves break in the open ocean that analogies to other kinds of waves break down, and indeed when the capacity of seawater as a holder of heat and as an aerosolizing medium exceed formal models of waves as mere curvilinear pattern. Understanding breaking waves is a question that keeps scientists on Flip up at night, because it is a question that they ask at night, when they do not have to deal with the turbulence caused by sunlight on the water-air interface. Moscow-born, Florida-trained oceanographer Ivan says to me, quote, the sun for me is noise, unquote. Working at night, he avers, makes the open ocean field more into a laboratory where variables are controlled, and indeed the flip of the platform from horizontal to vertical makes the vessel not so much immersed in the field as floating above it, situated knowledge becoming aspirationally unsituated, universal. I've run into Ivan as he's starting his day at 5 p.m. His instrument, on the starboard boom, features 2 mid-wave infrared cameras pointed down onto the ocean surface onto an area of 1.5 square meters. Onto this patch of sea, Ivan projects beams of infrared laser light just below the visible spectrum that he's arranged into grids and points and lines. He images those lines through 2 cameras to compose a stereo image, whose feeds that he translates into visibility on his laptop inside Flip's science lab. The lines wriggle on the sea surface, revealing patterns of turbulence. Infrared light, which reveals heat signatures, lingers for a moment after it hits the surface, leaving slurring traces. The images relay the material otherness of the sea, even as their eeriness emerges from algorithmic data conversions first developed for night vision surveillance. But while these look like otherworldly waves with invisible lives, they're also known through the thermoception of infrared, very much of our moment, when tracking the exchange of temperature across water and air may be key to understanding what medias theorist Nicole Starosielski calls the immense thermal volatility of climate change. This is another scientist on board who was doing research that projects laser light onto a sheet of laser light onto fog particles so that it kind of outlines the splashing of waves into the atmosphere and generates kind of a flipbook sort of movie of images that are just like a tenth of a microsecond apart. That is also being used to sort of understand how it is that waves break in the open ocean. What is all this research for? It's about making unseen sea territories readable, and as Naomi Oreskes has argued, he also told me that he liked this because it looked like Hokusai's. There's a whole other paper that I do that's all about the kind of threading together of all of these different aesthetics of wave breaking, from forensic oceanography to Hokusai's wave, which has been reproduced 1 million times in 1 million different ways, to Claude Monet and others. What is all this research for? It's about making unseen sea territories readable. And as Naomi Oreskes has argued, civil and military motives intertwine, though these flip in and out of focus, oscillating between figure and ground. Scientists have accommodated to the alternately loose and tightly coupled with a Navy structure, to the social form of research that may lead to dual-use technology with both quotidian public and military application. Consider the territory across which my flip trip unfolded. When I received instructions about how to get to flip, I was pointed to a map of the U.S. Navy Sea Range, a field of operations adjacent to the space within which flip, along with a bevy of buoys, another ship, and a plane, would map wave space for a project called Coupled Sea Air Processes and Electromagnetic Ducting Research, or CASPER for short. This is an image of Casper the Friendly Ghost from one of the laboratory notebooks of data for the mission. So there's always this kind of weird uneasiness about these military applications and this kind of cartoonish, joking kind of relationship to what in many ways can be seen as a quite deadly serious sort of enterprise, right? CASPER, as it was shorthanded, examined how electromagnetic signals travel across the sea surface and had key funding from the Office of Naval Research. For me, as someone who grew up as an East Coast transplant in Southern California, who bought into surfing visions of the Pacific as a space of imagination and leisure, this map of a militarized sea still unnerved me, jolting me into a queasy wonder at the military-industrial sublime, this vision of the sea as electromagnetic infrastructure. CASPER work is, as Donna Haraway would call it, belly of the beast stuff. There are many different oceans that overlap in this one particular patch, here including the territory of the Chumash, which is recently up for consideration as a marine sanctuary. So there's all these different kinds of oceans that are all kind of quite literally on top of one another, depending on how you flip your frame of reference. Spatialities and their meanings flip into and out of focus for scientists. Many on board do not think of themselves as doing military work at all. One tells me, quote, "I don't find it relevant whether research is funded by NSF or ONR, the Office of Naval Research. What I mean by that is that the Office of Naval Research funds basic research that benefits science, and any basic physics research can have military applications. Any basic research, actually. In a way, I'm quite thankful that NSF and ONR are funding basic research. I'm more of a pacifist. If people are funding basic research in a nice way and giving scientists freedom to do things, it's a good thing. It's public research, it's not classified, our results are published, unquote. I recall the argument of Chandra Mukherjee's A Fragile Power, Scientists in the State, that many military-funded civilian scientists have a sense of their work as too complex for immediate application. The structure of feeling that this creates, Mukherjee argues, is one in which scientists secure a sense of themselves as objective, not beholden to instrumental aims of their funding. This subjectification generates disinterestedness as a social resource upon which state spokespeople can then call as an epistemological resource to back up political arguments. As scientists flip frames of reference between subjective and objective, think of Wittgenstein's Duck and Rabbit, of flips flip from levity to seriousness, from field to lab, from mundanity to the excitement of being at sea, they operate within what I want to call paradigm scripts, modes of thinking that take for granted the possibility of seeing things one way and then another. To point this out is not to presume to know or challenge individual scientists' full or most personal motives, which may exceed any neat social analysis. Rather, it is to point to the operation of shifting frames of reference within which they, and many of us, find themselves/ourselves, and the effects of such operations. Flip, built in 1962, the same year Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions appeared, does not then offer a real revolution, so much as a partial rotation, a machine for making orientations, which, writes Sarah Ahmed, quote, shape not only how we inhabit space, but how we apprehend this world, how we proceed from here, which also affects how what is there appears, unquote. Flipping the paradigm script between pure and applied can create patches of experience that oscillate between seeing science as separate from or entangled with politics. Nowadays, scientists at Scripps are animated less by military concerns and more by ecological ones. I heard time and again in conversation about people's environmentalist motivation for entering physical oceanography. We have moved from the age of the Cold War to the era of global warming, to questions of sea level rise, climate, and pollution, things studied by people at Scripps Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptations. Scientists Greg Sennett and Falk Feddersen examine how waves generate heat upon breaking, which has implications for coastal infrastructures and sea level rise. And with new interest in the material effluent of waves, wave breaking becomes a process described not by physics alone, but also by chemistry, biology, ecology, and perhaps the social, natural, marine science forwarded by scholars such as Max Leboyrin in their Pollution is Colonialism. Scripps scientists now look at waves as avatars of anthropogenic process, even damage. On one of my last research visits to Scripps in 2019, I met atmospheric chemist Kim Prather, director of the National Science Foundation Center for Aerosol Impacts on Chemistry and the Environment at UC San Diego. She told me that when waves crash, they release telling traces of the bodies of water through which they travel. Wave bubbles contain organic materials, from lipids in small bubbles to heterotrophic bacteria in the larger bubbles, so that sea spray has a microbiome, a complement of microbial bits and bodies. So there are also complex organic, inorganic processes involved in waves. And this is a side view false color image of a wave crashing, which is tuned to reveal the presence of dinoflagellates and other small life forms that are bound up in wave breaking. Sea spray is largely made of particles of sodium chloride, but in areas like Southern California, where the atmosphere is dosed with nitrogen dioxide from car exhaust, a gas that fused with water vapor becomes nitric acid, sea spray also turns up heavily laden with sodium nitrate. Breaking waves therefore contain what Prather calls a chemical signature of human impacts. The wake of industrial and agricultural processes is legible in the wave break. Let me say a bit about the notion of the wake and the break. This is a quick swerve. A break is a broken or disturbed portion on the surface of water, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, and one that brokers an interruption of continuity. So let me torque the break to bring it into dialogue with Christina Sharp's notion of the wake, drawing also on the poet Fred Moten's In the Break, an analysis of the aesthetics of interruption, which he does with particular reference to the Black radical tradition from the jazz break to the breaking of language and poetry, in which he argues that a break is a spatio-temporal discontinuity that requires of those who experience it a fundamental reorientation. So I'm arguing that wave science is full of the wakes of history as well as existing on the edge of the knowable, of that which is about to break, that which is sort of suspended between one orientation and another. The reorientation in wave science from creating knowledge in the service of war to now often knowledge in the service of warning recalls to me Gregory Benford's 1980 science fiction novel, Timescape, in which scientists at Scripps, working in the early 1960s, receive a message from their future, 1998, warning them about a future in which oceans have been smothered by algal blooms, whose origins lie in 1960s failures to think about the long-term ecological effects of research on the ocean. In the novel, the messages sent in Morse code using hypothetical faster-than-light particles forestall an apocalyptic future as scientists are able to warn their predecessors, effectively erasing the wake that has been left for them. So this is kind of an allegory in many ways for what I found some of the younger oceanographers to feel about the science that they had inherited from their predecessors like Walter Munk and Willard Bascom, which had been sort of bathed in this bath of the Cold War and had generated all this sort of detritus that had left to them a damaged sea, a sea full of questions that were different from the ecological questions they wanted to ask. So this novel is really kind of a wonderful kind of allegory for that kind of intergenerational friction about whose knowledge counts for what in oceanography. Science fiction is a telling idiom through which to track changing ocean preoccupations and from different geopolitical locations. The Japanese comic book, Seven Seeds, set in a post-apocalyptic future, sees a group of disaster survivors discover a derelict ship that is modeled on the flip. When they board the abandoned vessel, the Fuji, it flips to vertical and inaugurates a countdown, and the explorers realize it is setting up to launch nuclear missiles. They find the control room corroded by iron-eating bacteria. This spectral manga flip scripts the craft as a relic of the Cold War, an enduring messenger of nuclear radiation to Japan across the Pacific. Slingshot to now. When COVID-19 became a matter of concern in the United States, some Scripps scientists were asked by California communities whether the coronavirus might travel in aerosols spooling off from ocean waves, a question preoccupying beachgoers and civic leaders. People from the Aerosol Center took an early cautious stance, and some surfers got angry, deploying predictably US American of the moment language about liberty and accusing those who would restrict surfing of being communists. In the event, the claim was modulated, and soon, scientists studying ocean atmospheres turned their expertise to studying coronavirus transmission more generally, flipping the script yet again. This last year, the University of California at San Diego founded the Institute for Indigenous Futures, part of the charge of which was the revitalization of Kumeyae seafaring technologies. The foreclosed future imagined in apocalyptic science fiction about the ruins of Flip is only one possible prospect for where oceanography around Scripps might head. Another future may be possible, some of the decolonial possibilities of which found experiment in September 2021 with the launch of Kumeyae Tule reed boats in San Diego's Mission Bay. Stay tuned. In his 2015 Anthropode lecture, Paul Gilroy calls for sea level theory as a remedy for high-altitude theorizing of the kind lately done by some Anthropocene commentators, who often seem to be thinking about the world as though they are in outer space. There are, of course, many sea levels, and I've hoped here to offer an accounting of how such levels have been framed, reframed, rotated, and reoriented in one tradition of oceanography, a one that may also be many, multiple, a superposition of patches, of spectra, of media, and of waves. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Maybe we sit here and we have a bit of discussion.
That sounds great.
Ci vedono? Possiamo anche chiudere le slide. Possiamo chiudere le slide intanto, così ci vedono solo. Great. Thank you so much. You brought us from the beauties of the shores and the ocean to some other places that are maybe a bit more dark, let's say. Any question, comment? So to break ice, I have one.
Okay.
So I think one key phrase in your speech, and you emphasize that, is orientations, not ontologies.
Right. Yes.
And it seems to me that your entire speech and argument is somehow encouraging us to move the gaze from analyzing ontologies as something that fix some ideas that are different from others and so on, but somehow to show us the ambiguities of many conceptions and ideas that coexist, overlaps, has similarities, coexist within the same space, but at the same time, they might mean very different things, and they can impact in very different way with very different consequences at the political level. And this is not really a matter of ontologies versus other ontologies, but in the ambiguity of this space, discourse, and practices is more a matter of orientation. And that is exactly what is confusing, maybe. Confusing, I mean, that people look like that people might speak the same, express the same concepts, but at the end of the way, they mean very different things.
Right.
So, and this is more subtle than ontologies.
Right.
So if you feel like to elaborate a bit more on that, I feel a lot of resonances with our historical time, but I let
What do you mean by resonances with our historical time?
Because in the current, I would say, global government, we hear some discourses that are, it might be appropriated by the left, but spoken by the right, but they mean different things.
Right.
They are mixed, integrated, shaken, and
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I was really interested in how the scientists themselves did that kind of work, that they flipped the perspectives that they had on what they were doing. And there's a lot of anxiety among the scientists about the military aspects of what they are being charged to do. Oh, there.
Better?
Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of ambivalences about the military framing within which the science is done. And so I became really interested in that flipping of perspectives that they themselves engaged in, which was sometimes to hold the things in contradiction and sometimes to hold them as possibly consistent with one another. That quotation that I had from the scientists sort of exhibits both of those, where there's simultaneously an ambivalence and an acceptance. Which is not to say there aren't different ontological worlds out there. I think that the Center for Indigenous Futures is doing something quite different from what the scientists themselves think they're up to.
Yes.
One of the things that someone asked me, someone thinking from Indigenous San Diego perspectives they asked me this question that really surprised me, which is, do the scientists ever ask permission of the waves to study them? And I thought, no. I mean, did I ask permission as an ethnographer to make, but in fact, the Thule boats ask permission of the sea to go out to sea, right? And there's a different sort of ontology there that I don't want to underestimate, or, I don't want to say that everything is just a difference of orientation. There are different ontologies that are in circulation as well. But that question of orientation became really kind of the hinge for me to understand what the scientists themselves thought they were doing and how they managed their own multiplicity and their own ambivalence. And especially that kind of flip back and forth between empiricism and wonder. So there's this constant, I'd ask the scientists to describe something, and they would try to describe it in the most rational way they could possibly describe. And then they would say, but I love this picture because it reminds me of Hokusai and the great wave off Kanagawa. And it's not an accident that they have a whole aesthetic of how waves should look. I had one extensive conversation with a scientist about drawing drawing waves on high school notebooks, which is what a lot of surfers do when they're between classes. They'll just draw these cartoons of the perfect wave. And so the scientists on board were some of those people, right? And that they would show me, like, this is the way I draw it. And so they had their own sort of sense of wonder bound up with this kind of commitment to empiricism.
A question, is there a mic? C'è un microfono per chi dice... per chi ha domande. Thank you very much, Stefano.
I had a question actually that follows on what you were just saying about something that I had never thought about before your talk, which is the role of sort of cuteness and cartoonishness in, I don't know whether to say in this orientation towards wonder or whether to say in processes of in sort of colonial approaches or militarized approaches to, like a way of saying we're not ethically responsible for this research because it's all friendly ghosts from us. And I really appreciated that you brought that up, and I wondered if you could say more about how you see that. Maybe cuteness is the wrong word, but when you said this thing about Fantasia as a model, so something that's a little hallucinatory, something that's a little Disney, something that's a little cute, but also nightmarish in parts, and then Casper the Friendly Ghost, and this penchant for acronyms. So everything is either a flip or a flop or a Casper or a... I'd just like to hear more thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm not sure what to add to what you said and to what I said, but one other place to think is the rhetoric of surfing, that surfing is so often pitched as this sheerly leisurely activity, and yet the possibility of surfing is made possible by particular kinds of real estate development practices. A lot of the materials that are used in surfboards come from military origins. There's a lot of ways in which surfing is sort of seen as the other to the military, and yet the sport of surfing as it comes to California, obviously it begins in Hawaii and it has a whole different history there, but the arrival of surfing into California produces this kind of lexicon of, if not cuteness, then leisure and relaxation that's very different from the military oceanographic, and yet is also completely entangled with it. And many of the scientists themselves are surfers. And so they kind of code switch between the sort of surfer dude kind of language and oceanographic language. And that might be another example of, if not cuteness, then like this different register, the register of leisure. And it's also bound up with whiteness and the history of whiteness on the California coast, and the history of segregated beaches, and whose real estate belongs to whose. And so, although that immediately complicates things because there's a much more working class history to military along California's coast and places like Camp Pendleton. So there's probably some kind of complication that you might want to add to that. Now I'm just thinking of that scene in Apocalypse Now where the general tells people, you either surf or you fight. And there's that sort of scene of surfing in Vietnam and being bombed at the same time, which really brings together this military and surfing kind of imaginaries in a way that's kind of shocking in the film, but actually is quite deeply revelatory of the way that those industries have been kind of bound up together.
Thank you.
Just to say, I would add not only leisure, but also the surf culture embodies this idea of counterculture.
Right.
Right?
Right.
No, just... sorry, Franca.
No, I didn't want to, anyway, I didn't want to ask a question, I might as well. Thank you very much for your talk. And I didn't read your book, so probably you might have talked about this in your book. I wonder, you mentioned some event in which indigenous people were involved, and knowing the importance and the role the ocean and
Right.
the different modalities of being with the ocean that the different societies and oceanias have. I wonder whether, in addition to the whiteness or blackness perspective, in what way were indigenous people involved in this, mediatic representation or scientific representation of the waves, and to what extent some groups, I'm thinking, for instance, in Australia, but also in Hawaii, some groups, indigenous groups of scientists contested
Right.
Scientific reports, non-indigenous or Western scientific reports. And I wonder whether you've talked about this in your book and whether, you could say something about this now. Thank you.
One of the things that I write about, thank you for that. One of the things that I write about in the book is Marshallese traditions of wayfinding and navigation around the Marshall Islands. And I'm particularly interested in the ways that that has entered into ethnographic kind of works of comparison. So I'm thinking of things like Edward Hutchins' book, Cognition in the Wild, or David Lewis's We the Navigators. There's a continual impulse in a lot of ethnography to draw comparisons between these different traditions of wave knowledge, often with the idea of trying to kind of compare them with respect to kind of global scientific kind of certifications of their truth values, which I find very problematic, to try to turn them into sort of two versions of the same thing, or to turn Marshallese wave navigators into kind of the pure version of the wayfinder, the wave navigator. And so there are some interesting, I don't have it, I'd have to get my book out of my bag, but there's some interesting poetry that's trying to kind of put Marshallese wave navigation into a decolonial perspective in solidarity with other freedom struggles around the global South, and to kind of turn it into something that's not just about a sequestered wave tradition, and also to acknowledge that wave traditions in places like the Marshall Islands have met with so-called Western navigation traditions before. So one of the people on board Captain Cook's Endeavour was Polynesian navigator Tupuia, whose knowledge may have been informed, the knowledge of Captain Cook himself. And so these traditions are not as separate as people are often want to to pretend that they are. And in that making them separate is what permits that kind of work of comparison and that work of pretending as though they haven't met, that they're not already always entangled. So I think so that's one direction I would take in answer to your question, is to point to the entanglement of the knowledges. And then there's I don't write extensively, although I could, about the Hawaiian traditions of wayfinding and Hawaiian traditions of surfing. And a lot of that's about territory and about claiming territory from tourists and claiming territory from non-locals, and claiming wave knowledge as a particular way into understanding the waters around the archipelago that are distinct from the ways that people like those on Flip might have understood them. Yeah.
Like in Australia, waves are named.
Right.
They've got proper names, which is pretty amazing, like toponyms.
Right. Waves are named by surfers as well.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing to think about what the name refers to. Does it refer to a recurring event? Does it refer to a particular shape?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can say that and there's been some interesting work in recent months in Brazil to try to grant waves rights along the rights of nature kind of discourse. So there's a particular wave in the coast of Brazil that is now the site of struggle for a rights-based kind of discourse to protect the conditions under which that wave can continue to take shape the way it does. there's a group of people called Save the Waves, who are mostly surfer environmentalists who go around the world trying to identify waves that they say are endangered, and then they use different discourses. There's sort of the Save the Waves, which of course is assonant with Save the Whales. But then there's, trying to use local kind of legal apparatuses to protect particular wave breaks, or in this case in Brazil, I think there's one in Peru too, to use the rights of nature discourse that's been used to think about rivers and so on, to think about waves, and to think about waves as persons.
Any question? Otherwise, I have a question on these.
Maybe I would just want to give the chance to talk about Venice for a second, because you have a chapter on one of the essays on Venice.
Il microfono.
So I was wondering if you, during your stay here, had a chance to revisit the essay in the book on Venice and the Venice hologram and the monks.
I haven't had a chance to revisit my own essay, but I do have a short. So the way that the book, well, I can't really project this. Is there a way I can get this back on the screen?
Possiamo per caso avere la slide, la prima slide?
The way the book is organized is it has these, it has 5 ethnographic chapters, which are cited in different places: the Netherlands, San Diego, Oregon, Washington, D.C., and Bangladesh. And in between, there are these sort of interstitial chapters, which I've organized into sets, kind of like the way white waves are organized into sets. And the one you're referring to is called Venice Hologram. And it's based on an essay that is itself also called Venice Hologram, which was written by Walter Munk and the oceanographer from Scripps, whom I mentioned a couple of times, is written by him and his art historian wife, who did a sabbatical in Venice. And they became interested in, they sort of bought into the precarity of Venice as a place, and thought about preserving the whole city as a hologram. Which at the time that they wrote this, which is in the 1960s and 70s, was a kind of 3D imaging that was very much part of it was very much in speculation as a mode of preserving the three-dimensional properties of objects. And so they thought of thinking about Venice as itself a hologram, and they thought about all of the interference patterns in the canals as themselves generating diffraction patterns. And now I'm thinking of Karen Barad. Generating diffraction patterns which could be re-engineered to produce a ghostly, there's Casper again, to produce a ghostly kind of after image of Venice. That's kind of, and so in the essay, I sort of meditate upon their notions of waves and loss and so on, and waves as constantly coming into being and bringing fresh realities into being at the same time that they erase others. But, yeah.
There is Offer. Offer, avevi alzato la mano? Poi Valentina.
Okay, thank you. As I was, I haven't read the book, obviously, also. So I haven't read the book also, obviously, yet. So I was wondering about all these, the fact that the perspective of scientists allows certain discourses of waves to enter and maybe leaves out other.
Yeah.
And obviously was thinking about the tsunami. I mean, there's anthropology is full of these particular, or in context of migration, we have all these very evocative images of waves in those contexts.
Right.
And so I was wondering how that enters into the analysis.
Evocative images of waves?
I have a very grim and particular one from the Syrian war in 2011 with the child on the beach.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So one of the set chapters here called Middle Passages is about Mediterranean migration and the use of wave modeling by people like forensic oceanography to trace where human rights failures have unfolded and where people have drowned. But part of what's interesting or troubling about that is, of course, there's the image of the wave of immigration, the wave of migrants that sort of feeds into the dehumanization of people. One of the other chapters in the book, called Wave Theory, Social Theory, is a long history of the wave image in social theory, from waves of opinion to feminist waves to waves of migration to waves of economic change. And one of the things that's remarkable about the wave image in social theory is its political polyvalence, that it can be used by left-wing and right-wing sorts of players in a way that's very fluid. And it's sort of an underdetermined, almost cartoon social theory. And in the hands of the right wing is very much about homogenizing people, about erasing humanity, about telling stories of the inexorable, unavoidable change that's coming. In the hands of the left, it's about collective agency and collective effervescence and revolutionary potential. But these things kind of flip back and forth between one another, depending on, what moment in time you catch the discourse. I don't know if that speaks a little bit to your question, but yeah, check out the Middle Passages set if you want to see what I have to say about the Mediterranean story and the ways that waves figure in that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the talk. It was very, very, very interesting. My question is about boundaries and boundary work. I've been looking at geological maps lately, and what really struck me is that the fine detail of the geological maps stops at the coastline, and very often the sea or the ocean is like a completely flat space.
Right.
And so, to me, the coastline represented not so metaphorical boundary between communities, not just between different spaces. And so I realized that maybe it is a matter of different temporalities, different problems, different questions that people ask. But I kind of realized that there are communities that don't speak very often to each other. And so I was wondering how the people studying the ocean and studying waves understand the coastline and how they kind of draw the boundary of what is their field, sort of. Because the coastline, when I think about waves, becomes a very sort of unstable boundary, something that is shaped by waves, and it also changes very quickly, and is changing even faster and faster with climate change. So yeah, I was wondering what happens at the coastline when it's seen not from inland, but from the ocean perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting because waves are understood to be packets of energy rather than material forms. And that kind of just, so if you look at diagrams of waves in oceanography textbooks, it gets emphasized over and over again that what's moving is the pattern, not the water. But that changes once you get to the shore, because then the water starts to move as well. And that's sort of this boundary between coastal physical oceanography and open ocean oceanography, which have two different ways of thinking about what waves are. And the word that, so there's the swash. The swash is the physical water that continues to travel even after the energy is dissipated. And so I think that oceanographers talk a lot about swash when they talk about coastlines, and that's the force that leads to the breaking down and erosion of coastlines. I don't know if that speaks to a little bit. There's also this wonderful idea that I've been meaning to write about called wave shock, which is a condition that organisms living in tide pools adapt to the presence of waves. So like sea anemones and things like that, that are adapted to withstand the pressure of waves over and over and over again. So that would be sort of yet another thing that's more in the domain of the marine biologists and the physical oceanographers. But it depends on whose map you're looking at. You know, if you're looking at oceanographers' maps, there's lots of maps of ocean waves. So one of the chapters, the fourth chapter in here, is about computer models of ocean waves that is based on fieldwork that I did at the National Weather Service, where a lot of people have just been fired by Trump, which means that some of the waves that they've measured and archived are probably not going to remain in the archive. There's a whole, now I'm answering a totally different question. There is such a thing as an archive of wave knowledge among wave scientists, and that archive is stored in computers. And if those computers aren't maintained, you lose the knowledge of what waves have been doing over the past few decades. And some of these archives are rather fragile things. They're on tape, like computer punch tape, because they're quite old, and they're decaying. And so that kind of knowledge is important to generate these maps of of climate change. Waves are not just forces of weather, but they're also forces of climate. And there is such a thing as wave climate, which the knowledge of which is at risk at the moment. Sorry, that was an answer to a totally different question that nobody asked.
Very interesting. Any other question? Vitska, you have a question? I would like to go back for a moment to what you said before, that there are attempts to attach legal rights to a wave.
Yes, right.
But as you said, you know, the wave is conceived as a pattern, not as the water itself.
Right.
So this somehow scramble up this idea of the Western legal person in
Right.
a way. What do you think about that?
I'm really not sure. I mean, I've only just been starting to read about some of this. How do you mean it scrambles up the Western notion of the person? Because the person is a body?
Yeah, yes, because some of the social science critique to these attempts to attach legal personality to a river or to a hill or whatever is that a mountain, a hill is not defined by its boundaries, but is an ecosystem which has broader repercussion, relations, and so on. So you can also keep intact the shape of the mountain, but then if you drill, for example, around it, anyway, the persistence of that same mountain is endangered.
Right, which is why granting it personhood is a mode of protecting it from that, I guess. And that's at least the rhetoric around the wave, is that it's protecting the conditions for wave flourishing.
Yeah, indeed, it's the conditions, not maybe the wave itself.
Right,
maybe.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah.
So that is something a bit different, maybe. I don't know, because I don't know this case, but it sounds like being a bit different from what has been done so far.
Right.
That is, in some attempts of preserving an object, let's say, instead the condition, precondition, and processes.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Any other comment? Victor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if it's a great question, but because here you're talking very much about the waves, the ocean waves, and so they're very material, but the idea of waves always take me back to that, the idea of light as wave and particle, no? This duality of it. And so I thought, what would be the translation of that in the more oceanographic sense? Is there such a thing of thinking about I think maybe it's related to the question of energy that you perhaps have just answered. But I was just wondering what happens if you think with this duality of the wave and the particle in the ocean as well. In that sense, I don't know if it makes sense.
That's an interesting point of disanalogy, because there really isn't a model of the wave as also a particle, although waves come in sets, and so you can make generalizations about sets of waves as having a particular force. So without getting into all the nitty-gritty of different wave science, there are waves, there's wave sets, there are wave trains, which are not quite the same as sets. So there's different wave groups. There's different ways that the scientists make categories about the waves, or make taxonomies of waves into groups which may sometimes allow you to make generalizations about them in the way that a particle is a generalization about light rather than the kind of trajectory of the thing itself. But the other thing is that there are lots of important disanalogies. So for example, light waves don't break. Waves in the ocean are the only things that break. And that's why there are these really interesting analogies. People make analogies to water when they think about light, when they think about sound, when they think about all kinds of other waves. But one thing that doesn't carry over is the notion of the break. Because when light hits something, it's not doing the same thing at all as a wave breaking. So there's a strong disanalogy. But I'm interested in those sort of things where the analogy works and where the analogy breaks down. And one of the things that I found doing this research was that scientists still don't have a good accepted story about why waves break. They know that they break. They know that they will break. They know even when they might break, that they break when they're 1/7 tall as the wavelength of the wave. But the question of why they break in a particular instance is something that's not well known. There are lots of theories from aerodynamics, from hydrodynamics, and so on. But, and the scientists who were out on the flip, when I was working on the flip, were all trying to answer this question about why the waves were breaking. And as I say, there's a very well-developed descriptive account of it. You can say definitively, this wave is going to break now. You can describe it, but to theorize it, is it because of some kind of hollow of pressure? Is it because of the pressure on the back of the wave? I'm talking about waves in the open ocean. We know why waves break when they reach the shore. It's because they start to feel the bottom. The orbits that the waves are kind of bound up in, hit the beach, and that breaks a wave at the shore. But why waves break in the open ocean is an open question. But
thank you.
And if there were analogies that people could draw from light or sound, I'm sure they would, but there aren't, because those waves don't break. Which stunned me when I learned that. I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. I had a question. So I've been reading Marcus Boon's book on the politics of vibration recently, and kind of the central argument of this book is kind of around the transmutability of vibration as kind of like a physical and sensorial force, and how this connects to, mysticism, mathematics, traditional musical cultures, and contemporary musical cultures, I guess. Yeah. But so I was curious in relation to this, sort of like waves also being kind of like a product of vibration in this particular way, as sort of a physical phenomenon, and also something which you're talking about as being an analogy, but also is not really just an analogy. It's also transmutable into a physical, right? Through water, aqua. There's water waves, there's air waves, there's radio waves, there's all these different kind of like things. Is there within kind of like the indigenous cosmologies or ontologies kind of like an understanding of this type of transmutation that I was referencing in this? I'm just curious.
Within indigenous cosmology?
Yeah, particularly because I feel like within science, it's kind of clear how those things kind of transfer, and I'm kind of like interested.
Right, they transfer through transduction of one signal into another.
Yeah, and also just sort of understanding kind of the equivalence of these sort of different forms and the relationships between these different forms.
I don't have an answer to that. I don't know about whether there's a well-developed. I'd have to think about a particular indigenous cultural context. So I don't have an answer immediately to that.
Okay.
Yeah, we mentioned Moon a couple of times, and now when you said something about the impossibility of understanding what causes the wave to break. I think that in the introduction to the book, you narrate this encounter with Mung and say, and how he kind of argues for this embodied knowledge of the waves, right? I thought that was such a beautiful entry point to the book as well, and to thinking about the waves. And I think that towards the end of the book, you kind of go back to this, you know, the impossibility of abstract kind of theoretization meeting the embodied knowledge in a way. And you say something like the waves are almost like the avant-garde, I don't know which word is before that kind of like tests the future before it becomes, right? So I'm kind of making a very wide, very big leap, but I'm thinking about the kind of relation between the thinking about the future and this, you know, insistence on embodied knowledge that seems to be somehow increasingly, you know, apparent for the scientists in terms of the Western techno-scientific models of knowledge production. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that now, and also in the context of this kind of new attempts of decolonizing science and discussions about what kind of epistemologies could lead us outside of the predicament we seem to be facing now, which is the catastrophe.
Yeah. I think one thing that surprised me in the fieldwork was that waves used to belong mostly to the physicists. And so the Cold War, that was the place where you went, is you'd go to the physicists and they would draw you some equations and the cosines and sines and so on. And when I was doing fieldwork at Scripps, you know, the last several times, I started to hear more from biological and chemical oceanographers who said, we can study waves too. The waves have a biochemical signature of human activity in them, or they have effluent that's bound up from sunken DDT stores off the coast of California, or agricultural effluent, or dinoflagellate blooms. All of these things are things where we need to understand both the biological and the physical. And there was one scientist who said to me, let's see, I can find his paper here, I think, Falk Feddersen, who's doing research around sewage flow from Tijuana, and is very sort of said to me that, right, the competing effects of breaking waves on surf zone heat fluxes, albedo versus wave heating. He said the question for this paper came to him when he was surfing, and he was in the water, and he was feeling the heat differentials between different parts of the sea. And he said, that's the kind of science that I want to do. And it's not the kind of science that people on Flip are doing, where you have this distance from yourself and the water, you're sort of aloof and above it. I mean, so he said, you know, for me, it has to be something that I can feel. It has to be something that we can sort of, that has an embodied component. So I think that, right, and then he was also doing this research about cross-border research in Tijuana and San Diego around sewage effluent and the ways that waves were moving sewage around between Mexico and the United States.
Around the estuary, or?
Yeah. And so, I don't know if that sort of speaks a little bit to it.
Yeah, yes, it does, actually.
Yeah.
I maybe have a last question.
Okay.
We have already spoken about these ambivalences and tensions between the motivations of and the agendas of the scientists. The slide that you have shown us is something we hear always from the scientists we work with.
This one?
In labs.
Yeah.
You know, there are different kinds of scientists, different disciplines, but that is the narrative. Also, as a team, we have recently discussed Mike Fortune's book, Genomics with Care, in which he speaks about this double bind.
Right.
And somehow you speak about orientation. So just as a concluding remark, how do you see yourself as an anthropologist intervening in that very ambivalent field?
I think it really depends upon what kind of science is, what the science is and what the funding profile is. So in Mike's book, you're not talking about military-funded science. There's a very particular kind of intervention or a very particular kind of diagnosis to be done when scientists are thinking in the context of military funding versus when they're thinking in terms of biotech funding, for example. So in Alien Ocean, I encountered almost nobody doing military kinds of research, right? And everybody was doing something that was either sort of putatively pure science or directly adjacent to biotech and capitalizing science. And so the question of what the structure of feeling is that the scientists have sort of really depends upon that. Whether they think the profit motive, I mean, it goes back to the old Mertonian norms about science, I guess, and how people feel that they are or are not able to realize the norms that they think should govern what scientific activity is, which is meant not to be profit-oriented, which is meant not to be immediately applicable to military goals, right? Although people have complicated feelings about some of that as well. So someone like Walter Munk, for example, never ever had any trouble accepting money from the military and thought that was a ridiculous question. Like, why wouldn't you accept money from the military? Now, of course, his coming of age was Normandy, and so it became, you know, a crucial part of his biographical warrant for why that kind of science. I guess that's the other thing, is that I have thought very much about generations of scientists, that scientists come into the profession at particular historical moments, and particular historical moments have a lot of effect on the structures of feeling that they have. And I think that you know, that did I mention that book, that science fiction book, really speaks.
Science things.
Yeah. Timescape, yeah. I mean, that was sort of like a brilliant way of thinking about the generational time within which science is done. So I'd say, to your question, I'd say a couple of things. It depends on whether the context is something like the military context or something like the biotech context. And then in addition to that, it also depends on the generation of the scientists, when they became of age, what was happening in the scientists, in the sciences at the moment that they got their PhD, when they started to do their postdoc. All of those things become crucial.
It's interesting to think how this particular moment of defunding and such aggressive, violent attack on science,
Yeah.
You know, is going to have, what kind of impact it's going to have in 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah, and I'm giving this talk and I'm feeling like it's already out of date, and something else is, some new formation is taking shape, and I don't know what it is, because I haven't done all the due diligence to know whether, you know, is this still being funded? Is this still being funded? Right? Like these are enterprises for which the Trump administration would have very little patience, right? And so my sense is that it's, you know, NSF awards $20 million for continued study of aerosols at UC San Diego. I have a sense that that grant has not been renewed, and other grants like it. And I also did field work at the National Weather Service with people doing computer models of waves, and a lot of those people have been laid off. And so now we have the ocean becoming blank again, right? The ocean used to be, once upon a time there were no waves in ocean maps. This is something that the sociologist Philip Steinberg says, you know, that the ocean was constructed as this pure blank, and then over the course of oceanographic history, we start to get first the trade winds and all of these, and longitude and latitude, and all these markings upon the surface of the ocean. And you know, now we have a very well-developed lexicon and grid and framework for understanding waves in the ocean. And now that's going to start to fall away, and we're going to start to have, you know, there be dragons again, and you know, patches that are empty of knowledge. Now, thinking then about the historians of science who talk about agnotology, the study of ignorance, and the study of the deliberate making of ignorance. And so what happens when the waves disappear from knowledge databases? That's going to be kind of the next question, I guess.
Yes, and the wave probably shares the same fate than other institutions that you have mentioned today, like these Institute for Indigenous Futurities or other things. So
yeah.
We have a lot of new questions in the way. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for those of us who didn't yet read the book, I think this presentation really sparked a lot of interest. We are all intrigued to read it because it speaks of waves, but much beyond only waves. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.